The indications that we're going to see tropical cyclone development as we approach the mid to late portion of June are now steadily increasing. Taking a look at the current water vapor imagery, we do see that there isn't really much going on in the northern Atlantic as of right now. We do have this small low pressure system now moving northward through Cuba, bringing heavy rain to Jamaica and Cuba. However, we do have a large amount of dry air surrounding this trough, where we do see that the Saharan dust is now moving towards the Caribbean, bringing drier than average conditions to much of the southern Caribbean as well as the northern Caribbean islands. And we also see that the Gulf of Mexico is experiencing drier than average conditions. However, I don't expect this stability to continue as we approach the mid to late portion of June, since we're going to see an enhanced risk of multiple tropical waves moving through South America and could eventually move into the southern Caribbean, and we could see a gyre form right over Central America that could potentially enhance the possibility of tropical cyclone development as we approach let's say the weekend of June 18th. So there's definitely something we're going to need to be aware of over the next several days. A multitude of tropical waves moving through South America. Taking a look at what the GFS model is forecasting at this time, and the GFS model has still been very persistent on developing a tropical storm somewhere around the southern Caribbean moving forward with the forecast. We do see that the GFS model expects, like I said, a multitude of tropical waves to move through the northern portion of South America, as well as a gyre to build right over Central America. As it's typical during the month of June, we see plenty of rainfall move over the Central American countries, as typically a gyre forms during the month of June, as it's considered winter during this time frame over Central America, thanks to the amount of rain you experience. So this could potentially contribute to an enhanced risk of convective activity over the southern Caribbean, for the potential of a tropical cyclone to enhance by the time we approach the late portion of June. And moving forward with the forecast, we eventually see that the GFS model wants to bring pretty much an envelope of moisture towards the southern Caribbean, and we see it right here just off the south on the Central American coast. And this is expected to move northward because the GFS model also expects that this big Bermuda Ridge will steer northward, and expects an upper level trough to dig in and allow the steering flow to shift from more of a southerly direction, which will force the storm a little bit further northward. Moving forward with the forecast, we do see that the GFS model eventually does want to strengthen this storm by the time we approach the Monday, June 19th timeframe into tropical storm status. And moving on into the more long-term future, we see that the GFS model is still very persistent on developing nearly a hurricane or a storm that is at hurricane status. And in this scenario, it does make a landfall in Florida, which has been different from the previous runs, because the previous runs wanted to take this a little bit further westward into the Gulf of Mexico, but the GFS model has shifted its forecast to bring it further eastward towards the United States, which is definitely interesting. However, look at the forecast hour I'm going at, it's still very far in the future, so it's definitely, definitely wouldn't take this seriously at all just yet. However, if we were to move into a more manageable forecast time period where we could more accurately predict what's going to happen, let's say right around the 198 hour mark, which is approximately around 8 to 9 days from now, we do see that there's going to be an envelope of moisture in the southern Caribbean, and it might not necessarily be considered tropical storm status at this point of the forecast hour, but when we see an envelope of moisture like this move into the open waters of the Atlantic during hurricane season, it's always something to be aware of, because this could easily strengthen over the very warm Caribbean waters. Of course, it's going to be dependent on other factors such as the upper level winds, as well as the amount of dry air that's going to surround this storm. Still a high amount of uncertainty regarding those factors, because those are definitely key if this is going to have a chance of developing. But when we see the GFS model, at least I wouldn't say in the near future, but at least in the more short-term future relative to what we've been forecasting over the past several days. When we see the GFS model bring this envelope of moisture to the Caribbean, that definitely does raise some flags regarding the possibility that maybe we could see tropical cyclone development. And the gyre is expected to stay over Central America for quite some time. So in any given moment, there could be an envelope of moisture that moves into the southern Caribbean. So this is definitely something we're going to need to pay close attention to over the next several days. Still too early to really iron out how the wind shear will be over this storm system, or if this storm will actually track northward at all, because it's also dependent on the steering flow. Really, it's going to be dependent on this Bermuda Ridge right over the northern Atlantic, as well as an upper level low that's expected to move into the Gulf of Mexico right around this time period. If the timing of those two are off just slightly, that could shift this moisture a little bit further westward, and would it necessarily develop in the Atlantic? Maybe the Pacific, but not the Atlantic, or maybe it just fizzles out as it encounters the higher elevations of the Central American region. So these are definitely factors we're going to need to pay close attention to over the next several days. Let's take a look first at the upper level winds to really see what the GFS model is forecasting when it comes to the wind shear over this storm system. So over the next several days, and even as we approach next week, the GFS model expects a strong amount of wind shear to stay over the southern Caribbean for quite some time. However, the GFS model has been very persistent on making this area of the Caribbean, the extreme southern portion of the Caribbean, very light when it comes to wind shear, and that could be enough for potentially an area of moisture to at least solidify and create an organized area where the rotation is very, very consolidated, and it would definitely lead to a more stronger heat engine. And moving forward, we do see that eventually the GFS model expects that the wind shear will lighten down closer to the Central American countries. It won't necessarily be at zero, because of course we're still going to see a moderate to strong amount of wind shear just to the north of this area. But for the most part, this area of light wind shear you see right here could be enough for tropical cyclone development. And if we were to continue to move forward, we see that this storm, even under strong wind shear surrounding it, is able to create an area where the wind shear is at least moderate enough for this to intensify, even though the center of circulation is very close in proximity to the stronger wind shear just to the northwest of it. And in fact, this wind shear could actually enhance the storm's intensity and intensification process, because that would allow a stronger outflow. So, of course, more air molecules would be able to move aloft and create a stronger updraft for this storm to continue to intensify. So it's going to be very interesting to see really what's going to determine the amount of wind shear that's going to be over this storm is the position of this upper level low that's expected to be over Florida by the time we approach June 18th. That'll be very key. If this were to move a little bit further northward, that would prevent the wind shear from moving as far southward, and that would enhance the possibility of tropical cyclone development. However, same could be said if this moves a little bit further southward, then we're less likely to see this area of moisture develop into a tropical cyclone, because the wind shear would increase for much of the Caribbean. So still a lot of uncertainty with this forecast, still very far out, but I'll keep you guys updated over the next several days. In terms of what the European model is forecasting, the European model isn't confident at all that any of the envelopes of moisture that moves through this northern South American region will develop into a tropical cyclone. And part of the reason is that the European model expects the wind shear to be very persistent and a lot stronger over the Caribbean than the GFS model, because even if we were to move to the point where tropical cyclone development would be at its highest risk, we see that the wind shear doesn't budge, and we see, in fact, this upper level low that's expected to move over Florida on June 18th move a little bit further southward. So that forces a wind shear to move a little bit further southward as well for much of any area of convective activity to potentially have a chance of developing into a tropical cyclone. So definitely the chances for the European model have been very weak for the most part over the past several days, and we're going to really need to see which of the computer models will end up being the correct one. We have to also keep in mind that the GFS model often does have a strong bias of developing random storms during non-conducive environments, because the GFS model to develop a storm that strong in the month of June is rare in of itself. So to see the GFS model stay confident that we're going to see a hurricane would be definitely a rare sight to see, especially if it moves up the northeast coast like the GFS model is currently forecasting. We can't rule it out because, of course, the GFS model is still a very reliable model, but the GFS model often does have a lot of those fantasy storms. That's what I was trying to get at. The GFS model does develop a lot of fantasy storms at times, and this could be another one of those, because it isn't every day we see a hurricane or a strong hurricane develop and make landfall along the coast of the United States during the month of June, where it isn't typically that active during that month with strong amount of wind shear over the Atlantic. So we definitely need to take the GFS model with a grain of salt. The European model could very well be the more accurate model in this case, but definitely we can't disregard the GFS model either. Another reason why the European model does not want to develop this area of moisture is due to the fact that the European model is expecting a stronger amount of ridging to exist just to the north of this convective activity that is expected over South America. And what this ridging will do is it'll steer this moisture towards the west rather than towards the north. And since the moisture for the most part will be over the northern portion of South America, it won't be able to we won't see any tropical cyclone development over land. So if we were to see tropical cyclone development, it would have to move further northward into the open Caribbean, where it could encounter the very warm Caribbean waters to provide it latent heat and lower the pressure along the surface for a well-defined low pressure system and eventually a tropical storm to develop. But in the European model scenario, the European model is expecting a little bit too much ridging, so most of the moisture will move towards the west, which would face much of the moisture straight towards Central America without having enough time to really develop a well-defined center of circulation or enough time to absorb a lot of that latent heat that would be associated with the Caribbean waters for a tropical storm to develop, since it will be over land too much if it were to take a westerly direction. However, the GFS model shows a different scenario, which is the reason why the GFS model wants to develop a tropical storm by the weekend of June 18th. We see that the ridging in the GFS's model scenario at the same time period is a lot weaker, and in fact we see a lot more of a dip when it comes to this trough over the United States. So this would allow an area for the moisture to be able to move northward with the surface winds moving more from a southerly direction, and that would allow the moisture to move north enough to be able to stay over water for quite some time before it eventually encounters land, which is the reason why the GFS model wants to develop a tropical storm in the same weekend. So how the ridging builds by the weekend of the 18th will be huge in determining if we're going to have a chance of Tropical Storm Bret developing in the Caribbean, because if this ridging were a little bit weaker, we'd see the storm move northward. It'll be over water for a more prolonged period for it to intensify a lot more. So we're definitely going to pay close attention to the ridging over the next several days and how the computer models shift their forecast when it comes to the amount of ridging and how far south this trough dips, because that'll be a big determinant in this forecast. Taking a look at the ensemble members for the GFS's models forecast, we do see that some ensemble members do want to develop at least a tropical depression just off the Central American coastline. The forecast is still highly uncertain. Again, we're going to need to pay very close attention to the ridging over the Caribbean to really determine if this will move northward and strengthen like the GFS model is suggesting. Here's the global tropics hazards outlook over the next 2 weeks, and we do see that for the week of June 14th and the June 20th, we see that it's expected to be drier than average over the Gulf of Mexico, mainly average for other areas of the Atlantic. But as we move into week 3, the week of June 21st and June 27th, we do see that an enhanced amount of convective activity is expected to develop over the Caribbean as well as portions of the main development region. So that certainly could enhance the possibility of tropical cyclone development, even if this current tropical disturbance that I'm talking to you guys about won't develop. There could still be another tropical disturbance that could develop out of this enhanced area of convection. So here's the MJO filtered forecast over the next several weeks, and we do see that the MJO for the most part is very moderate when it comes to its anomalies, and because we don't really see any strong anomalies anywhere with the MJO pattern as of right now. However, the blue represents a negative MJO pattern, which means that we're more likely to see convection and tropical cyclone activity, while the yellow means we're more likely to see stability and less tropical cyclone activity. And we see that as we approach week 1, which is the week of June 10th. We do see that South America is expected to be under a negative MJO pattern, which should be close enough to feel the impacts right around Central America and the Caribbean. So we should expect a little bit more convective activity than normal. And then week 2, we see that more of the Atlantic, mostly south of the equator, is experiencing a negative MJO pattern. So for the most part, we should mainly see an average risk of, or slightly above average risk of tropical cyclone development, thanks to the fact that we're going to be relatively close to a negative MJO pattern. So that certainly will enhance the risk of tropical cyclone development. As for the 7-day graphical tropical weather outlook, we see that no new tropical cyclones are expected within the next 7 days. However, that could change as we head closer and closer to the week of June 20th, where we could potentially see an enhanced risk of tropical cyclone development thanks to more convective activity that's expected over the Caribbean. So here's my overall forecast regarding the potential of Tropical Storm Bret in the Southern Caribbean. Still a high amount of uncertainty, but we're really going to need to wait and see how the ridging will build right over the Caribbean, because if the ridging is a little bit stronger, the moisture would move westward, and as a result, it would move more over land for this to have nearly no chance of developing into a tropical cyclone. But if we were to see a little bit less ridging, that would force some moisture further northward, and that would enhance the risk of tropical cyclone development. So definitely something we're going to pay close attention to over the next several days. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.